What we find again and again is that when we go to a controversial question, the scholar's political orientation is the best predictor of where they stand. For example, if you know an economist identifies as liberal and another one identifies, say, as conservative or libertarian, you already have a good guess with regard to how they might respond to a downturn or a crisis in the economy. We see this as highly predictive across the social sciences. Why is it that politics aligns so closely with where a social scientist stands on a controversy? We explain it through a particular school of moral psychology, but let me start, if I could, with just an example so that the listener knows what we're talking about. One of the criticisms today of social science is that it has an aversion or a resistance to biological reasoning, right? So some people call it biophobia. And for reasons that have to do with the long history of the way biology arguments were used for nefarious ends, colonialism and racism, even eugenics in World War II, there was this reaction in the culture that influenced the intellectual classes, where there was kind of horror to even think about biology. Steven Pinker writes about this in his book, The Blank Slate. So the stick was bent so far away from biology that any kind of biological argument often is met with discomfort among liberal intellectuals. So just to give one example, just to get the listener to have an understanding, a common sort of widely accepted view in evolutionary biology is that men and women differ in their underlying sexual psychology. So this idea that men and women play different roles going way back in prehistory, and due to even biological differences in sperm and egg, men have a greater instinct for sexual variety, which can be seen sort of more widespread view that men are more interested in casual sex, for example, than women. Now, that view is widely accepted in evolutionary psychology. And yet, if we ask, when we did ask, among dozens and dozens of other questions about other controversies as well, when we asked anthropologists whether they found that view was plausible, so we weren't even asking whether they think it's true. We were just saying, is it plausible that men have evolved a greater instinct for sexual variety on average than women? Very, very small numbers in the field believe this. So, and let me go back to the earlier point. We asked the social scientists in all of our surveys to self-identify politically. So they identify as either radical, liberal, moderate, conservative, or libertarian. And in the social sciences, there's virtually no conservatives or libertarians at all. So we can't even report them in the data. In our survey on economists, around maybe 10 to 15% of the field is libertarian. So at least we have some data there. In any event, going to the anthropologists, only 9% of the radical anthropologists, probably about a quarter of the field, believe it's even plausible that there could have been an evolved difference. And then among the liberals, it's 33%, so about a third. And then among the moderates, it's 36%. So very, very few people in the field of anthropology believe this is even plausible. And so it raises a whole host of kind of knotty questions. Well, one, why does politics predict in this kind of linear or stairway fashion so many controversies in the field, right? What's going on there? And then it has implications for science. Like, what are we doing in the social sciences if politics plays such a huge role in how we think?
By the way, today's guest is Dr. Mark Horowitz, a professor of sociology at Seton Hall University. So I just want to throw that out there. So I'm reading this paper that you're discussing, but it's titled, "Are Social Scientists Any Less Biased Than the Rest of Us? Our Research Says No" is the title. And then in this, you just say that we found again and again that when it comes to major controversies that divide their fields, academics' self-identified political orientation is the best predictor of where they stand, which means that knowing a professor's politics tells a lot about how they assess the relevant explanations and evidence. I guess it just seems like these professors are working backwards then. So they have this belief and then they create the research to back up their belief. Do you know who James Lindsley, Helen Pluckrose, and there was a Peter Boghossian are?
Yes, they're the famous Grievance study hoax in the various social science journals.
Right. And I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about idea laundering, and they equate it to money laundering, where you take dirty money, you run it through these processes and it comes out clean. And it's the same thing where you start out with this absolutely ridiculous idea, run it through these peer-reviewed journals. Then this idea comes out as science or fact. Then it goes into curriculum. Once it's in curriculum, it's taught, and then it becomes standard knowledge. And the fact is, people have said that professors have been extremely left for decades, but it didn't used to be that way. But now the fact is that everyone wants to talk about like how social media is the reason all these politics are amplified. To me, it actually seems like it's probably just from the fact that university used to be a lot more 50-50 Democrat and Republican. Then it just became completely far left Democrats. So you essentially have 60 years of idea laundering, and now these ideologies become fact. And then now to refute this, you're now like the nut job if you're in academia.
No, you hit on so many interesting threads there that are relevant. Let me say before I jump in and responding, our entire approach is not to call out. Like our goal in the internet and social media and so on, in our political culture, we have kind of a call out culture. It's all about, and particularly with academia, you have condemnations. Oh, look at the left-wing indoctrination. Look at the left-wing bias. And I'm not denying some validity to those criticisms. Don't misunderstand me. But in my formal work and the scientific work, we have no interest in condemning the ideology of scholars. Our interest is in understanding the ideology of scholars. And it's also not as deterministic as some characterize it. Even the statistic I gave you suggested 1/3 of the field finds plausible that claim about human sexuality and sexual difference between men and women, right? So the standpoint, or point of departure, if you would, for all of our research is to encourage greater self-awareness among liberal-minded faculty, especially given the extraordinary liberal preponderance in higher education that you just mentioned, Jesse. If we have a greater self-awareness, basically a move toward introspection, to understand that, wow, we have these underlying moral emotions. They're often unconscious. They nudge us to form social connections with people basically who think in kindred ways and arrive at the same empirical conclusions. You talked a little bit earlier about they start with a conclusion and they sort of orient their work around it. That is just human nature. I mean, human nature is, there's widespread evidence for how significant confirmation bias is to the way human beings think. We're motivated in our reasoning. We're not just robots collecting facts about the social world. So I do agree that in earlier decades, we had a healthier mix of political sensibilities in higher education than we do today. And the danger of having so many like-minded liberal left people, and the ratios in social science and humanities are just extraordinary today. In some fields, 20, 30, 40, 50 to 1. I mean, you won't find a single conservative. And I've been in higher education for 25, 30 years. And I've been on search committees, and many of us animated quite compassionately to make sure we have diversity with regard to gender and with regard to race. But when it comes to political identity, I have witnessed subtle ways and not so subtle ways in which a more conservative candidate would be excluded from consideration, right? So whether through self-selection of the social scientists or through outright bias of liberal-minded faculty, we've had the virtual disappearance of conservatives from the liberal arts and sciences and higher ed. And I agree here with the conservatives on that being a problem. It's just my tone and motivation is not to call out or to criticize, but to understand. So let me step back. How do we understand why this is happening? Well, I think the framework offered by this psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, he and his colleagues, Jesse Graham and others, developed an approach to moral reasoning called moral foundations theory. Haidt himself, pretty famous guy. His popular book, sort of unpacking the themes, is called The Righteous Mind, back in, I think, 2012. And I strongly encourage people who are interested in sort of the politics of knowledge. It's indispensable text to examine. And so what moral foundations theory does is it explains moral judgment by focusing on both our nature as a species, so it's evolutionary, but it's also deeply cultural too. So you could call it biocultural theory of how people reason. And it turns out people on the liberal left inherit different mixes of moral intuitions than people on the political right. So a good metaphor to think about this is to think about moral intuitions as dial settings on a radio, and they could be either higher or lower. You think of physical traits like this. People are taller or shorter, darker hair, right? Lighter hair. Well, these are underlying genetically influenced moral intuitions that in part we're born with. And then through socialization and through the cultural surround, it crystallizes into our political sensibilities and our political identities. So what are these moral foundations? I need to be a bit didactic just briefly here. Well, for Haidt, care and fairness are part of our mammalian, especially care, part of our mammalian tradition. Like, we care for our offspring. These moral intuitions, going back to evolution, by the way, served our ancestors well in helping them survive and reproduce, right? If you didn't have strong feelings of care toward your offspring, well, then they would die and your genes would not be passed on, right? So fairness has to do with how you're treated by others and the sensibility that you have. So if, say, there's somebody in prehistory who, whose friend gets sick and he goes out in the hunt and he brings food back to his friend. And then when it happens to him and he gets sick and his friend comes back to the village and says, sorry, sucker, no food for you. Well, if that friend wasn't wired psychologically to feel a sense of injustice, like, wait a second, you got to reciprocate here. What's going on? Well, that person has a greater chance of dying off, right? So this is a very simple explanation for how these moral intuitions that we have regarding care and fairness have deep evolutionary roots anchored in the brain. But let me stress again, Haidt's theory is not biologically determinist. It's just a first draft of the brain that we have with these inclinations that then interact with our cultural surround and our socialization to shape who we are. Conservatives, on the other hand, their dial settings are higher with other intuitions that have deep evolutionary roots. So conservatives tend to feel in their bones more respect for authority in society. They feel it's more natural. They're much, much more likely to look up to an established leader. And I should stress, these are averages. They also feel a stronger sense of group loyalty. So you might notice in political discourse how conservatives will tend to wrap themselves up in the flag. They'll sacralize the group and tribe more, the nation or symbols of the nation more. Something that bothers conservatives that liberals wouldn't care at all about would be, say, a president who goes to another country and badmouths the country. I mean, liberals are like, well, maybe we deserved it. Conservatives are like, how dare you? This is our country. Or even flag burning. Conservatives will be on the side of saying people should be punished for that. This is a sacred symbol. Where liberals are like, well, it's not great, but it's a freedom and we should support it. So that's an extremely simplistic. There's also other moral intuitions that he talks about bearing on liberty and feelings of sanctity. But let me not go too didactic there. For the listener, there are underlying biopsychological tendencies that influence how people interpret evidence in the world. And when you have overwhelming liberal preponderance in higher education, what you have is the care and fairness foundations or moral intuitions overwhelmingly dominating how people think in higher ed. And so what that means, if you have hypotheses that in any way are perceived as threatening the interests of the vulnerable, because care is all about how you treat the vulnerable. Think about the stereotype of the bleeding heart liberal. There's lots of evidence in social science that stereotypes often have at least a kernel, if not a chunk of truth, right? So you have the bleeding heart liberal on one side who's crying for the polar bear and the working class. And you have the rock-ribbed Republican stereotype on the other side, or conservative, right? Who is going to, there are certain values, there are certain norms, there are structures to society that must be honored and respected, right? Okay, so given all of that mapping, why would anthropologists bristle at the idea that men and women could be sexually different in their psychologies? Well, then that would mean how men and women behave is justified in their mind, right? Okay, so if men act inappropriately or if they objectify women, say, that means it's built into their biology. And they don't like that. They want a world where you have greater equality. They don't want women to suffer, right? They don't want vulnerable groups to suffer. Another datum in my sociology piece, my colleagues Anthony Hayner and Ken Kickham and I did a piece called Sociology Sacred Victims, which was discussed as well in the Scientific American essay. There we ask social scientists whether it's plausible that women gravitate toward people-oriented fields like social work or nursing more often than men, in part for biological reasons, that men and women really are different. Women on average are more nurturant than men, and that men are more comfortable on average working with things. Because this is a big controversy in social science. Why is it that we have underrepresentation of women in STEM fields, for example, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that old Larry Summers controversy going back, decade or so at Harvard, but he speculated that there could be biology to this, and it created all manner of havoc for him. He ended up retiring from his job. I'm not saying it was only due to that, but it didn't help. So there's this reaction to this idea Could men and women cognitively be different and emotively be different? And could that play some role? The dominant position in social science is socialization. Boys and girls are brought up, with young girls given a doll, for example, and a boy given a G.I. Joe. And that process of encouraging certain social roles lead women to choose to become nurses or social workers or childcare workers, and men to become more competitive in particular fields, whether in politics and the economy or so on, right? Or sexism. That's another widely accepted view, that men in positions of power are preventing women from obtaining these roles due to stereotypes and the like, right? Well, we simply asked, we actually, in our question to sociologists, we accepted that. We said, yeah, sexism and socialization are important reasons why we have gender inequality in the economy. Could biology, though, plausibly play some component role? So we asked that question. I do have the numbers here. So 16% of the radical sociologists find that plausible. So they just reject, 84% of them just reject out of hand the idea there could be any biological component. Because again, if you accept the biology, then the inequality becomes natural, at least in part, right? And then 35% of the liberals think it's plausible, and then 39% of the moderates. Again, this is a stairway or linear process. We also ask the question whether political efforts to increase women's representation in STEM fields, although desirable, may not arrive at perfect parity or equality due in part to biological reasons. So it's sort of a twist on the same question. Like if we attempt to encourage women to go into STEM, maybe it won't reach 50-50, in part for biology. And only 4% of this radical sociologists and 7% of the liberal believe that's plausible. And actually only a quarter of even the moderate sociologists find that plausible, right? So there's this strong resistance to hypotheses that in any way are perceived to naturalize inequality in society or lead to disparate outcomes in society. So, and when you get liberal-minded people with strong care and fairness sensibilities joining into moral communities together, they tend to engage in in-group, out-group behavior. They police out hypotheses that run counter their shared sensibilities, and science, and I would argue society as a whole, gets harmed by it.
As you mentioned Jonathan Haidt a few times, there is a 2011 article in the New York Times that was called "Social Scientists See Bias Within." And it was talking, of course, Jonathan Haidt was interviewed, and he says in this 2011 New York Times piece that anywhere in the world that social psychologists see women or minorities underrepresented by a factor of 2 or 3, our minds jump to discrimination as the explanation. But when we find out that conservatives are underrepresented among us by a factor of more than 100, suddenly everyone finds it quite easy to generate alternative explanations. And kind of going back to the grievance papers with James Lindsley, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian that I mentioned, I mean, basically they had 20 papers that they wrote. They ended up getting busted by a reporter. I think when they had about 7, 4 of them were already accepted in peer-reviewed publications. They had like 3 others that were accepted, but they weren't published because they're in the process before they got found out. And then I was reading like research papers about it, and they were just like, well, that was a small sample size. It doesn't really count. And then if you read articles on why there are so few conservatives in the social sciences, a lot of times it's like, well, conservatives are just stupid, so they don't actually have the cognitive capacity to actually be in the social sciences. They're not smart enough. They just kind of like, there's all these reasons that basically denigrate the actual conservatives. So it seems like it goes against everything that they would say if it was another. Imagine if they said that about blacks or about some other minority group, they would then be probably kicked out of their profession. I just find it to be absolutely fascinating how it just seems like it's just the cognitive dissonance is so insane.
Well, I think they prevent a lot of the dissonance by policing out those sorts of things, claims, and then developing, as you just said, alternative hypotheses that protect their own intellectual integrity. Again, I would say this is human nature. It's always the other guy who's biased. Like, I see the world clearly, it's just the facts. I can't tell you how many times. I have a colleague and I work in the social behavioral sciences program here at Seton Hall University. And for the senior seminar course, we require students to read texts on controversies that take contrasting positions. So students have to encounter more conservative views as well as more liberal and radical views. And I can't tell you how many times I've mentioned that methodology, encouraged it among my colleagues, and there'll be this instinctive, well, those people are just wrong. Why would you entertain these ideas? So the insight that I had pretty early on when I was carrying out these surveys is that when you have interpretive communities that are simultaneously moral and emotional communities, they don't perceive claims made by people outside the tribe as just empirically wrong. They perceive them as morally wrong. Like, this is not, how are you even entertaining that? And when you have all these other like-minded colleagues that have gone through their own process of motivated reasoning to exclude even the mere plausibility of a particular hypothesis, you're going to be demonized and marginalized at the end. There is an ongoing debate about why we're so liberally dominated in higher ed. I tend to lean toward the view that it's mostly self-selection, that conservatives just don't find a home and they don't choose to go in. In my experience in search committees, we don't get that many outright conservative-minded candidates to the extent you can infer it when you're talking with them. But I think discrimination could be happening as well. I wouldn't say necessarily consciously. I think it's a genuinely felt kind of disgust. I encountered this with the sociology paper when it came to inner city poverty in the Black community. There's a kind of resurgence going on in recent years, taking seriously the old culture of poverty. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, Jesse, but there's this view that there are cultural practices in poor communities that work to the disadvantage of the community. So this is kind of being revisited when it comes to inner city poverty, what they used to call the so-called underclass. And so we asked, again, we give high credence to the standard sociological view. We say, yes, discrimination, racism, Jim Crow, the historically inherited poverty, all of these things are real. But could it be possible also, though, that certain cultural practices matter, right, in the Black community? We had one question where we asked sociologists whether the Black community has any responsibility at all, any agency to address the problems of out-of-wedlock birth and violence in their communities. Let me see if I can find it here. 30% of the radical sociologists think they don't have any responsibility, that the poverty and social problems in the Black community are due to white society, to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that still endures through things like microaggressions and stereotyping and targeting of the Black community. Just over half of liberals, 52%, think there's any responsibility of the Black community to address these problems. And then 71% of the moderate sociologists. So when you have a social science field like sociology, overwhelmingly liberal left, you're not going to entertain hypotheses that could in any way, in this particular case, be perceived as blaming the victim. Because if you say, well, they have some responsibility, it means that not everything was determined by slavery and Jim Crow. Right. That's one of the options, too, in my senior seminar class. I have students read an anti-racist book that takes the dominant sociological view. So they might read Ibram Kendi or Ijeoma Oluo or Michelle Alexander, but then they have to read a more conservative view. So this conservative political scientist named Wilfred Riley wrote a book called Taboo, where he happens to be Black himself, but he's a Black conservative, and he argues that racism, although real, is trivial in explaining existing social problems in the Black community, and that the overwhelming reason is cultural. So again, these are hypotheses that many, many people in society think are plausible, and academia, to the extent that it becomes a liberal monoculture, it's not going to speak to the problems realistically. It's also going to alienate the public, and we're going to contribute, I would argue, to our own illegitimacy. There's data, of course, in society that more and more people are feeling that a college degree isn't worth it anymore, especially if it entails taking out loans. The conservative side has always criticized higher ed for sort of indoctrinating left-wing ideas, but we don't make it any better when we're a monoculture. And again, what do left liberals do when they get together? They tend to sacralize vulnerable groups, right? They sacralize the victim group. And then when you do that, when you treat anything as sacred, it means it's off limits. You can't besmirch it. And it leads to all manner, I would argue, of one-sided hypotheses and one-sided theories rather than approaching the truth. And which is why I'm a member with my colleague Anthony Hayner and of Heterodox Academy, which is an organization Jonathan Haidt helped found, which encourages more viewpoint diversity in higher education. How exactly to get more conservatives in higher ed, I don't know, but it would be a good idea.
Since we're talking about how much science is there to the social sciences, and in the email exchange we had, you talked about postmodernism. And, I graduated from university like 2 decades ago, so I had to brush up on what postmodernism is. And as I mentioned, Helen Pluckrose a few times, she has a book along with James Lindsay called Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. And then there's just a quote from their book talking about what postmodernism is. But it just says postmodernism rejects the idea that there is one objective reality that science and reason can reliably discover. Instead, postmodernism argues that what we call truth and knowledge are shaped by culture, language, power, and lived experience. Rather than universal truth shared by all individuals, postmodernism emphasizes multiple group-based perspectives that can be seen as equally valid. And there's a reaction against Enlightenment ideas such as objective knowledge, universal human nature, reason, scientific progress, and individualism. And so if a lot of these sociologists or other researchers and the social scientists, if they're looking at everything through a postmodern lens, then everything is essentially a power dynamic and there is no universal truth. So what is the research? I mean, I guess is what they're saying. I mean, is that like what percentage of researchers and these social scientists are looking at everything through a postmodern lens? And then what is the implication of that?
Yeah, my take on it is related to what you just said. It's just I would frame the dynamic slightly differently. We actually asked in our sociology survey what the number of sociologists who embrace or integrate a postmodern or post-structural perspective, and it's actually very small. It's less than 10%, like formally postmodern. So what I think is going on is a little different. I don't think that most people in social science, and you're not alone, Jesse, in not being familiar with the postmodern literature. I think the vast majority of current anthropologists and sociologists, even social theorists, aren't necessarily, deeply versed in Foucault and Derrida, and some of these classic French postmodern thinkers that help lay the foundation for this perspective. I mean, some of them are, of course. Foucault had a huge influence in social science, certainly in the 80s and 90s, and so-called science wars at the time. But I think what's ultimately going on is less so much of a commitment to postmodernism as a commitment to social justice as perceived within social science fields. So when hypotheses emerge that are uncomfortable to left-wing sensibilities, the view, well, what's true anyway, is congenial to people. And so then they might coquette some language from postmodernism to justify, it's all about power and inequality. I remember discussions recently, just because of the Supreme Court decision last year with regard to eliminating, again, this is super sensitive, but eliminating affirmative action in higher education. And I just remember talking to many of my colleagues, and they just resist this idea that it's even happening. They're like, oh no, it's a holistic review. They'll deny that candidates are let into programs with lower scores. So it's all manner of motivated reasoning to not confront a system that's obviously palpably not meritocratic. So the idea, what's true anyway, or all of these standardized tests are illegitimate in some way, that they often don't subject those claims to deep scrutiny because they would be wrong if they were to explore them. And so they push out ideas that could threaten their sort of consensus, moral consensus. And in that case, the postmodern view that all knowledge claims really reflect a jockeying of power in society and reinforce structures and hierarchies is very congenial to them. So that would be my take. I don't think it's necessarily a sort of principled embrace of postmodernism. And let me say too, here's another reason. If you ask social scientists whether climate change is real, I mean, I'll bet you $1 to a donut, 99% are going to say, absolutely, it's real. We have to take it seriously. So all of a sudden, they're going to be hardcore realists about the world. They're not even biologists or ecologists, right? They're going to bring in a high degree of certainty on that. So there's a kind of selective adherence to truth, right? And that suggests to me that more is going on than just objective appraisal of the evidence. When you look at social science debates, they're almost always moral debates. They manifest as intellectual, and they use all manner, oftentimes, of very complicated methodologies. But in the end, they tend to reproduce viewpoints of the world that protect the sacred victim, right? And exclude hypotheses that could in any way be interpreted as rendering inequality in society natural or desirable. And again, conservatives themselves, their moral dial settings are much, much more oriented toward the righteousness of natural hierarchy in society and the importance of group loyalty in society. If academia were characterized by overwhelming numbers of conservatives, I think the findings in my surveys would be different, but I would still carry them out. That's not where we are. We have overwhelming liberal preponderance, but I haven't studied this, but my hunch would be if we surveyed historians who call themselves conservatives, they're much, much more likely to say, oh yeah, the second bomb in World War II was necessary. It saved lives in the long run, and then they're going to do their own motivated reasoning to find arguments for that, where a more liberal left historian would say, no, the first bomb wasn't legitimate, wasn't even necessary, never mind the second. So it's just an example to try to stress to you and the listener, my agenda and my colleagues' agenda in these surveys is not to call out either side. Both sides, all of us as human beings have underlying moral intuitions that we may or may not be conscious of that nudge how we perceive evidence in the world. Haidt talks about flashes of approval and disapproval that are unconscious. And that nudges us toward people that interpret the world in similar ways and that arrive at the same kinds of conclusions. So the only way to minimize this damage to science is to make sure we have viewpoint diversity and to encourage a greater degree of introspection and actively seek out ideas that run counter what we believe to be accurate about the world. Nothing could be more important. And I say that to my progressive friends all the time. Have you read anybody you really staunchly disagree with lately? And they'll say no. They won't be familiar. If they're familiar with a very conservative thinker, they'll dismiss them. But nothing could be more healthy for their thinking and for society as a whole. And as I think we talked about last time, Jesse, there's wider decline in civic and social trust in our society today. There's high degree of political and social polarization. This is needed more than ever as a social practice.
You mentioned a small percentage, I think you said like 10% or so believed in postmodern.
Well, sociologists said that they used that in their work as a paradigm, which was a relative, it might even be lower. I'll have to check. Certainly below 10%. Yeah.
Right. But then if you look at, like, say, the most cited social scholars of all time, it's number one, Karl Marx by a pretty big margin. Number two is actually Foucault, who you mentioned. And so even though they might not actually call themselves a postmodernist, it seems like the actual people that they're citing and getting their influence from would be considered that. And then it's like, also I mentioned Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsley in that talk. They mentioned a paper when they were talking about the idea laundering, about how there's this paper called Doing Gender, and it's been cited over 30,000 times. I mean, most studies people don't even read, and if it's cited a few times, like, that's pretty good. So just because someone never even heard of, how many people have heard of Judith Butler, but how many times has she actually cited? So it's like, just because she's not mainstream doesn't mean that her ideas are not mainstream in academia. I mean, you have some of these people no one ever heard of, and they're cited hundreds of thousands of times, even more so than Milton Friedman, or Thomas Sowell's only been cited 30,000 times, something like that. And Doing Gender has been cited as many times as all of Thomas Sowell's research. I mean, that's pretty insane when you start thinking about like some of the more illuminated thinkers of all time.
It's famous enough for me to be familiar with, the Weston Zimmerman on Doing Gender, I believe. I'd respond to that. I'd push back a little bit, Jesse, without getting too arcane into Marxology. I don't think Marx thought in any way or had an epistemology that said there is no truth or there's multiple truths. He may have been wrong. We can have a separate podcast on that, can debate it and discuss it. But he had a theory of how money and capital and how tensions and economic downturns are going to be inevitable in the way the economy is set up, and how long-term automation, Marx was anticipating processes of automation that would occur in the economy that we're even witnessing today. So he had no doubt many things right and many things wrong, but he was certainly committed to the truth. I think when people on the right, for example, say that, well, Marxism and postmodernism are the same thing, I think they're reacting from their own moral sensibilities. They're uncomfortable with the attack on the group. They're uncomfortable with the attack, say, on the United States, the attack on, as they see it, meritocracy, the title cynical theories, this view that the left is subverting traditions that ought to be validated in the West. I think there's a kind of conflation, let me put it that way, when people put Marxism and postmodernism all into sort of one boogeyman. I think more of what's going on is simply emotional creatures constructing knowledge in the sciences based on the shared values they have, rather than the ideological framework of Judith Butler or somebody else being their motivator. They, like you said, they don't even read these things oftentimes. So then what are they doing? They're citing them because their conclusions are ultimately going to be, as they see it, emancipatory. And they see Butler as fitting this idea that, oh, gender doesn't have to be deterministic. It can be fluid. So I think these kind of simple schemas in tandem with people's underlying moral intuitions is what's really going on. And I just have to say, I'm averse on both sides. I don't join in call out culture on the left when it's criticizing the right, and I don't join in call in culture on the right when it criticizes the left. I have like my scientific thinking cap on all the time. When I was younger, I used to be deeply engaged in political activity. Most of my adult life was in progressive social justice work. I've turned away from that, and now I've just decided I'm committing myself to the science and trying to minimize. I don't want to pretend that I'm somehow floating above the fray in perfect objectivity. That would be very aggrandizing and certainly untrue, but I strive. But one of the things I noticed, we all learn in graduate school you got to put your biases to the side. It's one thing to say that, it's another thing to actually do it. If people were putting their biases to the side, you wouldn't find the data in my surveys that you find, right? The biases are alive and well. So in my own experience, there had to be a crack in the armor. I had to and it was through reading Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt where that first happened, where I'm like, wait a second, some of my assumptions potentially wrong. So I brought some of these chestnuts from evolutionary psychology, like the controversial one we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Like, well, wait, could men be wired more toward casual sex because they produce a lot of sperm and they could have a lot of children if they, I raised this with many of my mentors and friends from graduate school, and it was met with fierce, emotional resistance. I don't think any of them actually read the literature, but they certainly detested it. And that was part of my change in worldview when I realized that sociology is a moral community, not just a scientific community, and that I had parroted certain ideas based on my own moral sensibilities more than on kind of hard-headed reasoning. But sociology is not alone, and I have that economics paper with my colleague Robert Hughes, and I think economists have their own libertarian moral sensibilities that blind them potentially to things that are almost certainly true. I don't know if you saw the datum from the Scientific American piece, but only 43% of libertarian economists think that fossil fuel companies deter the introduction of alternative energy, where the vast majority of liberal, like 80, 90% of liberal radical economists think that. So what's going on there? Why would a libertarian go, oh no, fossil fuel companies don't do this? Well, there's a long record of how fossil fuel companies fight at every effort toward alternative energy, not because they're evil, terrible people, but because they have a product to sell and they want to keep selling it. So I wouldn't exempt anyone across the political spectrum from the role of moral intuitions in influencing and ultimately distorting how we carry out science. So my call would be viewpoint diversity, not joining one camp and saying the truth is the monopoly of that camp.
Kind of mentioning the whole concept of the idea laundering, and then reading this. This is from the British Psychological Society from 2025, so last year. The title is "It's Time for Psychologists to Become Activists," and this is again from the British Psychological Society. And the gist of this article is psychology should not be committed to neutrality, as this is ethically bankrupt, in that real healing requires therapists to openly confront power, injustice, and oppression besides their clients. And in the same article, it says, what can psychologists do? And it's identify as anti-oppressive therapists and take a stance. And this is where I said the idea laundering, where it actually does have real world implications. I can't imagine, so you're going to your psychologist, you already have issues, and then your psychologist is like, you're the victim, society's oppressing you. To me, this is where we've gone from, where you put these things into place 40 years ago. This is where we end up now, where every generation has been indoctrinated into this. I mean, how can any psychologist, you literally have 12 years of education and you now should be an activist? I can't imagine going to a psychologist Yeah, because I have issues, and then it's like, oh yeah, okay, you don't like Trump, all your problems came from him. Let me identify with you. It seems asinine to me.
Yeah, Haidt's colleague Greg Lukianoff writes about this, how harmful that. And again, conservatives use this word in a pejorative way, so I'm reluctant to use it because I don't want to be positioned in that way. But the kind of woke ideology infecting therapy in our society and psychology in our society, yeah, it's extremely dangerous. I'm not a psychologist, but I have enough common sense to know that taking agency over yourself when you're experiencing lots of serious psychological maladies is critically important, rather than reproducing this kind of fatalistic view that, well, you're just a product of these larger oppressive forces. And then if you're encountering someone who happens to have more conservative moral intuitions, you have someone go in to see a therapist who happens to be a Trump supporter, God forbid, and you just, the whole thing puts ideology ahead of truth. And so my point again would be, we're not going to fully liberate ourselves from our moral intuitions, but we can minimize their impact by becoming aware of them through introspection and encouraging viewpoint diversity and engaging ideas that challenge or unsettle us. And I think then we're going to have the full richness of hypotheses, that we ought to have if we're going to be doing science well, right? In the anthro piece, that there were, I don't think it would be interesting to the listener because they'd have to be familiar with some of the legacies of these people, but there were these famous anthropologists, Napoleon Chagnon, who wrote a book about the Yanomami, and how the anthropologist to praise his legacy ends up reflecting the moral intuitions. There was this critique of the famous indigenous activist Rigoberto Menchú by David Stoll. And we talk about some of these controversies in anthropology and how people's interpretations, like take Chagnon's work. Chagnon characterized the Yanomami indigenous peoples in the border of Brazil and Venezuela as being very warlike. He ended up doing serious ethnography. He lived there for decades. And, but he had an evolutionary biological view, which again, social scientists tend to bristle at. And he suggested that there was, pretty continual raiding and warfare in these villages, and that the young men in the Yanomami tribe that were unikai, or the killers of other tribesmen, ended up having more wives and children. And so anyway, it wasn't a very upbeat view of human nature being conveyed through his depiction of life among the so-called fierce people. It faced lots of opposition among liberal left-minded anthropologists. And when you survey them, how they appraise his work, whether they see it as credible, directly predicted by their political orientation. The more moderate anthropologists and the tiny number of conservative ones are going to see his work as credible. And by the way, I shouldn't be too overly deterministic. These are always averages. And that goes back to the earlier point of why I don't think this is a totally deterministic view. You're going to have radical anthropologists who love Chagnon's work occasionally, right? So I like to think of moral intuitions as tugs that push us, especially if we have social groups that reinforce it, like silos. But the more we become aware of it, the more we can step back and say, wait a second, am I agreeing or disagreeing with this because of the empirical validity or because it resonates with my tribe? And that's a very, very healthy step. I'll give you one last, just so the listener knows what these surveys are about. In my sociology survey, we asked whether opposition to immigration can ever have any legitimate foundation. Can there be a legitimate reason why you wouldn't want to have open borders, say for cultural unity? And, or is it really only just racism and economic anxiety to oppose immigration? That wasn't the exact formulation of the question, but that's more or less it. And only 21% of the radical and 43% of the liberal sociologists think it's ever could be legitimate to want to call to curb immigration. You see 54% of the moderates. So the moderates are more in alignment with public view. So yeah, so it's yet another example of the stairway process where our political sensibilities predict where we stand on a controversial question. And I think the way to address it is through more introspection and viewpoint diversity.
As you've talked about these surveys where you're surveying professors, grad students, PhD students at these public academic institutions around the United States, and the gist of a lot of these is that political ideology is the strongest predictor of these social scientists' conclusions on controversial issues. It's even stronger than methods, data, or their professional training. I'm just curious how you actually get your research findings published. It seems like this goes so contrary to what people would think, or if they do think it, to actually have it validated by research. Like, one, how do you actually find journals to publish this? How do you work at Seton Hall University. How do you get Seton Hall to sign off on this kind of stuff? I mean, you are tenured, so I guess maybe you have a little bit more protection.
Well, that if I wasn't at the time. I was doing
at the time, right?
Let me say, by the way, our surveys are of faculty. Sometimes people get confused. It's faculty that have, I should have said, that are teaching in PhD programs instead of in graduate programs, because some people think I'm surveying graduate students, and I'm not. So we survey faculty members in, like I said, in sociology, anthropology, economics. We did one in developmental psychology that we never published, but we find this, like you said, this finding again about the role of political identity. And how did we publish? Well, it took a while. The very first one we did was on called Wither the Blank Slate. This goes back to 2014, 2015, about over 10 years ago. And I mean, the editor sat on it for like 6-7 months and then wrote back. I kept emailing him and he wrote back and just said, well, it's too controversial. And I very frustratingly said, well, why didn't you just do that and tell me that when I submitted it? I lost 6 months, right? So many of these took several iterations. And if the listener goes and reads any of these, you'll see strong kind of emotional opposition to questions themselves. So, for example, we asked the question whether, out of wedlock birth, a kind of code in the city of kind of this toughness code in the inner city could exacerbate a bad situation. There's a lot of literature on a kind of student subculture, not just among blacks, also among whites. If you go to the working class whites, very famous work in England on this. But this idea that academic achievement's not being black, basically, you're trying to act white, right? So if you're not studying as much, your family structure, you don't have a father in the home, could these cultural variables exacerbate, in addition to the legacy of slavery and discrimination, and lead to these outcomes? And just asking the question, Jesse, I'm not exaggerating. If people turn to the study, people will say things like, you're a white supremacist. I detest this survey. You're obviously biased. You have an agenda. So the very first thing people do when they don't like an idea is they project a motive onto the scientist that's nefarious, a kind of ideology critique, right? And that's the danger of this kind of monoculture. So anyway, to go back to your question, a lot of times we have to negotiate with the editor, and sometimes it takes 3-4 different journals. One of my pieces got into a pretty kind of lower tier journal for that reason. I was surprised with Current Anthropology. It's among really my only really top tier journal publication. I was surprised that the Science Wars piece got published there.
As I mentioned, Peter Boghossian and some of the, James Lindsay before, but I've listened to you in a podcast, or actually a couple of podcasts. Was it the Institute for Liberal Values on YouTube? I think it's the Dissident Podcast, whatever. But in this podcast, you were talking with, I believe her name was Elizabeth, about tenure. And she was mentioning, just because you're tenured, they can still get rid of you. They can fire you if they want. They can mess with your schedule. They can take you off certain committees. They can take away your research grants. And if you can't get, maybe you're not actually meeting X criteria, so then maybe you invalidate the terms of your contract and then you get let go or whatnot. Even if you're tenured, if you don't necessarily follow the corporate university protocol, you still actually can get pushed out. I mean, is that true? I mean, I think from someone that's not in this space, I always just kind of thought once you got tenure, you're golden. You can kind of do whatever you want, modest, like punching out a student or, sexually harassing students in class, very egregious stuff. But is it actually true? Like, can they just hey, we're going to have you teach a course at 5 a.m. on Saturday? Like, can they actually mess with you that much? How much protection do you actually have as a tenured professor?
It's hard to know and hard to study. I can say at a former university I'll leave unmentioned, I was kind of being groomed to be a kind of fellow of the provost's office. And then they ended up not wanting me there because I just asked these sort of annoying questions that ran against the assumptions. But I do remember in one moment, this administrator, higher level administrator, kind of whispered to me, he goes, well, of course we can get rid of anybody at the end of the day if we need to. It kind of like, wink, wink, nod, nod. So he kind of confirmed that view. But again, I'm not a call out person and I think the administrators are nefarious. I think they're probably just capitalists and they want to make sure the market's going to work for their university and they don't want controversy to come up and put a bad name. So let's say I were to write some of the work that I deals with sensitive questions on race, for example. Like one of the questions in my anthro piece visited this issue that's probably the most polarizing of all, like the Ashkenazi Jew success in society. Could their success be linked in part to an actually natural difference in IQ that's biological and it was widely detested. Anthropologists were offended by the question. You can't ask it. Let me see. I think I have it here. No, I guess the numbers don't matter. Suffice to say, it's very low. The 6% of radicals, 14% of liberals found it plausible that there could be a genetic component. But let's say I went further in that direction. And we know from experience, there's been scholars that have gone in what's called a kind of race realist direction who've been pushed out of their academic roles. I don't think they had tenure. But yeah, so if you go to ideas that are really, really seen by left liberal intellectuals as being not just empirically wrong, but just morally disgusting, you're taking a risk if it creates like a blowback, I think, on your campus or something like that. And of course, there's notorious examples of scholars. Gaussian himself, I haven't read his backstory recently, but there was a day on campus where all the white professors were told they should stay home. And he was like, I'm not doing that, wherever he was teaching. And he ended up facing massive backlash for not. Are you sure that's not Brett Weinstein? That's Brett Weinstein, right?
Thank you. That's Weinstein. Yeah,
that's Brett Weinstein's background. Exactly.
I mean, Peter Boghossian and Weinstein were friends, but that was at Evergreen University in Olympia, Washington, I believe.
Well, thank you for the correction.
Because Peter Boghossian was Portland State
and
University.
And Boghossian also left academia for some reason having to do with his perception of kind of this ideological. Right.
Yeah, I'm not.
But I don't remember the reason.
Well, yeah, I don't remember. Exactly. I remember he was on the Joe Rogan podcast like 7 years ago, and he was talking about they're getting him for Title IX violations. And he's like, again, it didn't matter if you're tenured or not. He's like, if they want to get rid of you, like basically what we're talking about. And Joe Rogan was asking him like, oh, what's going on? He's like, I don't know. So I don't know if he got pushed out, but I don't think he's there anymore. But that's another thing. Yeah. Like you say something in class that some students offended by, and all of a sudden now you're getting blasted with a Title IX violation.
Yeah, and there's surveys. There have been surveys done of faculty where it's going to probably follow on political lines, but I would expect gender lines as well, where some people are like, no, we should disinvite a speaker if someone's going to be hurt by that speaker. So there's this kind of anti-liberal sensibility coming out of the left right now. And the one area where I think left-wing people can be authoritarian, because the literature in psychology suggests a strong association between conservative political sensibilities and authoritarianism, which makes sense because their average tendency is to be more oriented around hierarchy and loyalty. So you can see a kind of connection there to authoritarianism. Yet when it comes to a perception of any vulnerable group being harmed, the left can get together in a very authoritarian way. And I think that's what we see with cancel culture. That these hypotheses do not have a place, should not be articulated. Yeah.
I've read studies like that where you're talking about how the right has these authoritarian tendencies, but then I was reading how a lot of social scientists were surprised by the COVID lockdown, where the leftists were the ones that wanted to be authoritarian. If you don't get your vaccine, like basically you should be locked up, rounded up, put into some prison because, you need to take this quote unquote life-saving vaccine. And so then now they're saying, oh, like, well, and if you take a look right now where you have like in Minnesota, where you have these far left liberals going around trying to be like their own police force and trying to find out, people in rental cars and like, oh, hey, you might be an ICE officer, and they're surrounding people. It seems like, so they don't like the police, but they themselves want to be the police. It seems like they're the authoritarians. And again, knowing how skewed the research is, I don't even know how much I believe.
We'd probably have to do a separate podcast to sort of engage on the intricacies of the authoritarianism research. I'm somewhat familiar with it. My dissertation advisor is deeply influenced by authoritarian work, and more recently, Bob Altemeyer's work as well deals with this. So it's not just the work from the 50s, but I would say that you're right, that you do see this manifest. I think what the underlying psychology is, though, when the left is authoritarian, it's for different reasons than when the right is authoritarian. And I think when the left is authoritarian, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just trying to explain it, it's they perceive everyone's going to be harmed by COVID. Like there's going to be mass death if people don't do this. Or the vulnerable immigrant is being torn out of their home. And they're not reasoning in terms of, well, they broke the law, countries need borders. because from their perspective, it's like, well, there's really no legitimate reason to not have open borders, or at least be more permissive in this unequal world. Many liberal intellectuals will believe that the only reason countries around the world are poor was because of colonialism. And were it not for the bad behavior of the wealthy European countries in the world, those societies would be wealthy themselves. So if anything, because of our mature recognition of our own culpability, we need to also welcome these people in. So these ICE agents are functionaries, harm to these vulnerable people, and we must stand in unity against it. So both sides can be authoritarian. I think the underlying moral intuitions are likely to be different, though, and I don't think we should conflate them. But again, I would encourage, it's not about calling out either side, and I would say it's not about joining one team or the other. At least from a scientific point of view, it's trying to map and understand and collectively work toward building trust, because we have very, very little of it across political lines.
There's a prominent scientist from Stanford, John Ioannidis, who, was maybe 15 years ago, he had some papers come out where he basically said that 85% of medical research is wasted or unreliable, because essentially how the system works, studies are too small or poorly designed. Positive results get published more than negative ones. Researchers are rewarded for new findings, not for being correct. And that most of these studies are not replicatable. And this is in medical research, where you actually have a laboratory setting. You are actually able to control for one variable. If he's saying that it's 85% in a hard science, what would it be for the social sciences, where I don't even know, like, you're not in a laboratory setting? I mean, sociology is the study of society. There's thousands of variables. How are you ever going to try to correct for any one of them, let alone thousands? And then what is it like? What's the whole Hawthorne effect? If someone knows that they're being observed, they change their behavior. So if you're actually doing like these observational studies in sociology, now the person's behaviors change because now they know that they're being watched, right? Like, what do you think about this research, and how does this relate to, say, sociology, anthropology, psychology, economics, etc.?
Yeah, it worries me. I wouldn't pretend to have even any percent of knowledge to be able to address such a wide-ranging question. It fits anecdote. I've heard that from people myself too, not just scholars making the claim. I've heard people talk about how students are, going back to the former podcast we did, the decline in preparation of students, the decline in literacy in our society, the reduction in number of people that are reading in our society. I genuinely worry, and haven't done enough formal study to be able to give an informed response. My intuition is that that researcher said is increasingly real, that even in the hard sciences, they're not going to be exempt. There's, of course, been a replicability crisis going on in psychology and other social sciences, which is a healthy thing for us to confront the errors of the past. There's been attacks on, p-hacking and statistical techniques, only, publishing novel and new findings that could be interesting. All of these things are positive developments. Hopefully, science builds in enough corrective mechanisms. The very fact we're talking about this problem could be meaning that we're going to be addressing it. But I don't know. I'm more narrow in my own social science field, and the modest contribution I'm making is it connects to recognizing our moral psychology and its role within our scientific knowledge making.
So kind of last, final big question before we wrap this up, but I was listening to our first podcast that we did, and you had a stat that it's something like 40% of students at Stanford report some type of disability. And as you're talking about the sacred victims, I guess my question would be is, what's society going to be like in 10 years from now if you have 40% of students graduating from Stanford that have a disability once they get into the workforce? What's the disability? They're on the autism spectrum. They have anxiety. How do they actually function in an actual workplace?
Yeah,
you go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it worries me. It worries me a great deal. Again, this often gets articulated on the political right, and I don't want the listener to think I'm necessarily joining that team in that regard, in lamenting this and worrying about this. But the emphasis in colleges around the country is, and again, for largely economic reasons, but also cultural reasons. It's like retention, retention, retention. There's some conservative observers who suggest that this has to do, and this is super controversial, Jesse, to say, but they say it, that there's more and more women in administrative roles. Women are more nurturant, more compassionate. So many of them will say, well, if employers don't hire people with these disadvantages, then the economy has to change. So those roles have to change. So when the student gets out, the roles have to be open to neurodivergent and other sorts of things. So, if your mindset is on protecting the vulnerable and you get this widespread, not just within faculty, but within administration, the old norms of higher ed, the old norms of you got to come up with the right answer, and there's a competitive effort to have the truth come out of this struggle, and there has to be some element of tough love. I mean, over the years, because the culture's changed, I try, because I'm a very sensitive person, and I remember when I was an undergrad, no one likes to get negative feedback. But over the years, I'm having to layer my comments to students' papers with, listen, it's difficult, it's hard as us as faculty to give critical feedback to students, and you shouldn't take this personally. I mean, I'm writing these things and I'm going, oh my God, should I be doing this, or should I embrace a more conservative, tough love perspective? And what kind of society are we going to have if we're coddling people from the get-go? And again, this isn't to suggest that the mental health crises aren't real. I think Jonathan Haidt's been doing recent work on, the impact of social media and how damaging it is on our collective psyche. I think there's widespread just anxiety in our culture linked to things like climate change. Young people are facing so many anxieties. The economic landscape is brutal. Debt is massive. So there's a lot of good reasons for people to be feeling these things. But a social system or an academic system that moves increasingly in the direction of always accommodating it and moving away. I mean, in extreme cases, you'll hear examples of going back to postmodernism. Well, what's truth anyway? Or, where there's no objective standard for learning, where it's just, well, we got to just make sure students learn something. Let's get rid of grades and all the rest. Well, they're going to pay a lot of money to go to college. And if we continue in this direction, it can be a kind of, again, this is a conservative term, but a sort of like a pathological compassion, if that makes sense. Like I think Jordan Peterson writes about this, or actually he says narcissistic compassion, where he's being more critical. I don't think the left liberal administrators and others are narcissistic or any more narcissistic than people on the other end of the political spectrum. I think we're all subject to virtue signaling. But that said, I worry about this kind of unleashing of collective compassion and what it will do in preparing young people today to navigate an increasingly difficult global economy with obviously competition with Asia, and the U.S. position in the world obviously declining in its relative power.
It's always good to offer solutions, right? So what are some of the solutions? I mean, you're talking about, sacred victimhood, about how these researchers and these social sciences, their politics predict what type of research they will actually be putting out. How do we actually correct this? I mean, the issue, like, I was kind of mentioning about the British Sociological Society, was that this research turns into policies. Real people, everyday people, are affected by what this research says. So how do we actually get this research to be as accurate as possible so people are not under these policies that negatively impact them or impact them in ways that is just flat out not true?
Yeah, I mean, it's small what I'm trying to do. I mentioned Heterodox Academy earlier, but if we can work toward viewpoint diversity in our institutions, if we can have more conservative voices, it just means we're going to get hypotheses that are different than the ones that liberal left people are likely to articulate. I mean, that's going to have to be a crucially important part of this. I think some honest just reflection. I keep stressing introspection about how our biases lead us away from quite realistic assumptions about the world has to be part of this, right? And I think each side has its blind spots. I think I may have mentioned to you before, like, I think we do need to reclaim the conservative values of hard work and merit. I think we need to work toward meritocracy. The critique of meritocracy on the left it's so easy. It's like low-hanging fruit. It's like, well, it's never been a meritocracy. It's all, the power structure's always been unequal. Okay, even if that's true, does that mean we get rid of standards then? Is that really the solution? That can't possibly be the solution. And we're not going to have, going back to your example with medicine, we're not going to have the top students developing the new medicines and the top theorists figuring out how to inform our policy with accurate understandings of human nature and society, right? But on the other side, conservatives have their blind spots too. They, as I think I said in the last podcast, they believe that the market will resolve a lot of our problems, but that I think the market's harming what's going on in higher ed right now, because universities need students when you have a debt-financed regime. And if students are unprepared, there's a pressure, an economic pressure that adds to the moral argument to reach out to the vulnerable, and it leads toward a lowering of standards as well, just to echo what we talked about last time, Jesse. So yeah, each side, I think, needs to recognize, introspect about what their emotions are, what their values are, and then we need to ensure that we have people that are going to be presenting points of view that fundamentally disagree, and we should actively cultivate engaging people on the other end of the political spectrum. If you're on the right, you should be listening to the left, engaging them, and we need to turn the temperature down. We have to move away from call-out culture altogether. The difficulty is that it's human nature to be this way. So people love to get red meat, right? Someone says something, if I say something on this podcast today, it's super anti-Trump or something, you'd have these liberals, Horowitz guy's great, But if I said something terrible about, Democrat or Biden or something, the right would like it. So it ends up being less, in our hyper titillated social media environment, it ends up being less interesting a lot of times, unless there's a good guy and a bad guy, when in reality our problems are deeply structural and cultural, and we need to try to work toward cooperation and mutual understanding, as touchy-feely as that sounds.
Today's guest has been Dr. Mark Horowitz, who's a professor of sociology at Seton Hall University. Just two final questions. One, where can people find your work? We've talked about several of your survey studies today. And then leave us with a final thought, either related to this podcast or whatever is on your mind.
Okay. Yeah, well, you can find me. I think the easiest way is just going to Seton Hall. It's a website in sociology. If you can write my name down, you'll find my profile. It lists all my relevant research. My email is there as well, and you can certainly contact me if you have any questions or comments with regard to anything you heard, or if you just want to engage me on some of the writings that I've carried out. Final comment. Well, I've appreciated this, Jesse. I hope it spurs more. Again, going back to the key theme, what we talked about today, more self-awareness. I think I said this in the last podcast, a greater willingness to be uncomfortable, a greater willingness to take on ideas that make us uncomfortable. The thing I say to students all the time, do you believe something because the evidence suggests it, or do you believe it because it's congenial to how you feel? Do you disbelieve the claim because the evidence weighs against it, or do you disbelieve it because it makes you uncomfortable? And by actively cultivating the engagement of ideas that make us uncomfortable, I think we intellectually grow. I would even say emotionally and spiritually grow. And in a context, like I said a little bit earlier in the podcast, Jesse, of so much social polarization, so much name calling and so on, that can only be healthy, I think, for our society as we try to harness science for our collective flourishing. So I'll leave it with my standard final thought there.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.